Good afternoon. This is Media Center Ukraine, Odesa. We are starting today with the briefing dedicated to the compliance with the state language legislation in the south of Ukraine. Our speaker is Yaroslava Vitko-Prysyazhnyuk, representative of the State Language Protection Commissioner in the south of Ukraine. Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us today. In spring, Taras Kremin, the State Language Protection Commissioner, said that the south of Ukraine was on the second place when it comes to the violation of the state language. Have you seen any changes over the last month? Odesa is in the three top countries, or anti-top countries. I wouldn't say so. So there is Kharkiv on the second place, Kharkiv Oblast, and Kyiv is on the first place. And I wouldn't call it an anti-rating, because it comes not about the amount of violations, but to the amount of information provided about these violations. And does it mean that there is not so many compliance in Vinnytsia region, that the legislation is not violated there? Now, it is more about activeness of citizens, about their rights to protect their language rights, to protect the language law. And over the last year, we have seen a trend in the Odesa region. That's why I wouldn't call it an anti-rating. This demonstrates how often our compatriots respond to the violation of the state language legislation. We have received 206 requests from the citizens related to violation of the state language legislation. And when it comes to the frequency, the most frequent are complaints in the provision of services. On the second place, the language of the internet resources. The third place is the language of advertisements, commercials, different signboards, and announcements. There are also complaints related to the compliance to the state language legislation in the healthcare area, in the educational area, and also our officials, representatives of local authorities, self-government bodies, and of course these people are always under scrutiny of our citizens. So if there are violations, we cannot always respond to them quickly. But sometimes I have such cases when I miss something, but I receive a lot of messages about some official, about publicly using non-state language, which is the violation of the legislation in force. We check these cases in detail, and since the 1st of January, I've taken a lot of different measures related to self-government bodies and the higher education institutions. Somehow, unfortunately, the Odesa region is on the first place of this anti-rating, because when we made summary as of the end of August, since the 1st of January, there were 11 state language control measures related to higher educational institutions, including 5 in the Odesa region. But unfortunately, that was not the end of the story. We also initiated investigation because we received information with evidence about not using state language of representatives of one of the higher education Odesa. So does this mean that the teachers use Russian language? Yes, we have taken state control measures. We have drafted several administration protocols for these violations, but unfortunately this is not the end of story. And all the teachers, they know Ukrainian perfectly well. Their level is enough to teach their students in Ukrainian, But they continue violating the legislation, and I cannot explain this. Don't they answer the question? They do answer it, but they cannot always explain this. Because sometimes they say that students ask them something in Russian and that they are more used to teaching in Russian language. And some students ask to explain in Russian language, but other students send complaints about that because of the violation of their right to be educated in Ukrainian language, in the state language. They record these cases, and usually it happens during remote learning. We receive records of lectures from Zoom or other platforms. So we get evidence about not using the state language by some teachers. We have audio-video evidence, and we are entitled, and also we must respond according to the legislation informs. Do you have any evidence about anti-Ukrainian statements? As far as I remember, we have had none of such cases in the Odesa region. There was a huge scandal in Irpin, if I'm not mistaken. But as far as I know, sometimes there is a public scandal, but then we don't receive any information or requests. And from mass media, we learn that that educational institutions quickly respond to such cases on their own. So we can see that the population, citizens are preoccupied with this issue, and sometimes we don't even receive complaints because these issues are solved at the spot. And we all the time underline that during the full-scale invasion, our citizens do not tolerate violation of the state language legislation. Coming back to officials, who violates more this legislation, the Municipal Council of Odessa or the Regional Odessa Military Administration? And I cannot provide this information because when it comes to the state control measures that have been recently taken in Odessa, and we also have considered the cases in Mykolaiv Oblast, and this mainly related to local councils in Odessa. That was Belgrade Municipal Council, Belgorod-Dnestrovsky Regional Council, in Mykolaiv Oblast, Yuzhno-Ukrainska Local Council, Pervomayska Municipal Council, and as for the Odessa Municipal Councils, there have been several administrative protocols because some of the people's deputies did not use Ukrainian language during session, and there was a big case, and that was Grigory Ditenko, and the protocol was drafted against him as well. As for the municipal council, can you provide information about the people who were involved in the scandal? If I'm not mistaken, there were two people's deputies, and we received complaints from citizens. During the live event of the session, people saw that those deputies did not use state language, so we called them, and the administrative protocols were drafted. What political forces do they represent? One of the deputies is from Doveryai Dela, and the second deputy from the former opposition platform Zazhitya for Life. They are out of fraction now. As for the city mayor, Gennady Trukhavin, do you receive any complaints against him? No, and this is quite interesting. And this is important to say that since 16 July last year, the new legislation norm came into force, and which is administrative fines. And after that date, we have seen no public failure to use Ukrainian language, to speak Ukrainian language? And what is the amount of fine for the first violation for officials? This is from 200 to 400 non-tax minimum revenues of citizens. I don't remember the exact amount. This is more than 8,000 hryvnias. Or if it's for the first time, they can be only just warned. And what about teachers and tutors? Do you just talk to them, or do you impose fines? We also draft administrative protocols, and I'm, as the representative of the State Language Protection Commissioner, is obliged to draft such protocols, and then I provide this information to the State Language Protection Commissioner, and there they decide the sanction. I do not monitor all the cases, but I think that taking into consideration explanations of the teachers, and that they were able to prove proper knowledge of the state language, so we just warned them. I know that there are a lot of complaints against Russian Odesa taxi drivers who speak Russian language. Do you see any positive changes here? Since the beginning of the year, the Secretariat of the State Language Protection Commissioner has conducted a range of control measures. We have controlled such carriers as Uklon and other taxi companies with regard to the violation of the state language legislation by drivers of those companies. As far as I know, some of the companies have taken administrative measures, and after the series of scandals that was in spring last year with regard to specific drivers, the companies started quickly responding to such cases, and I think that now in the app you can even submit information about the violation of the state language legislation by a driver. And I can say that recently we have not received complaints about violation of this state language legislation by the drivers, and as for my personal observations, I can see that after these events, drivers are more focused on the language they use, and they mainly use the state language. As for restaurants and cafes, we sometimes can see scandals when waiters or waitresses refuse to speak Ukrainian. I know that you also respond to such cases, and what are the results of that? The situation is changing here as well, and I think that the key role here is played by the society. Yesterday we discussed this issue with your colleagues, and we all think that recently we have not had any huge scandals related to language, contrary to spring. And I think that the business owners are now more responsible about state language legislation, and this is one of the reasons why we don't see so many language scandals recently. Administration and employees of restaurants and cafes, they try to speak Ukrainian language, but sometimes we receive information about the violation of the state language legislation, but usually these are some individual outlets, not networks. And usually we first discuss the topic with the violators. But if they continue to violate the legislation, I talk to them at the spot. And if it is needed, we take measures envisaged by the legislation. And one of these cases, that was a restaurant in Odesa. we received a complaint. Actually, that was a series of complaints. And when I arrived, and I was surprised to see that the situation was rectified. They provided bills in Ukrainian language. The services were provided by the state language. And I made a conclusion that perhaps those citizens who sent complaints to us discussed that with the administration of that event, and administration just took corrective measures. You also noted that we get 262 complaints from the 1st January 2023, so for 9 months. And I would like to say that this is the number not from the city of Odessa alone, but from the whole Odessa region. But sometimes people from other cities and regions send us complaints about the violations in Odessa or the Odessa region. And one more question: do you receive more complaints from the Odessa residents or from Topiсs? We don't have such statistics, but when it comes to my personal observations, we cannot specify some group here. It depends on the case. Usually people state as their place of residence is Odessa, and I rarely get complaints where it is stated that it is submitted by an IDP. So I believe that Odessa residents, they just respond to such violations. Thank you very much for being with us today, and I would like to remind that we've had with us Yaroslava Vitko-Prysyazhnyuk, representative of the State Language Protection Commissioner in the south of Ukraine, and we discussed compliance with the state language legislation in the south of our country. We will continue at 1 p.m.